When I lost my daughter at 7 months, I was hemorrhaging on our bathroom floor. But my husband Douglas screamed that I'd caused it out of spite. "You did this because you couldn't handle Evelyn being pregnant too," he raged. His sister Corinne held my arms while their mother Carrie pressed me down. Then Douglas kicked me in the ribs while I bled our baby's life away. I crawled out into the December snow wearing nothing but a hospital gown, leaving a trail of blood on the pristine white steps of the house I'd called home for 3 years. That December night changed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But to understand how I ended up bleeding in the snow, you need to know how perfect everything seemed just hours before my world collapsed. My name is Diana, and 6 months ago, I was living what I thought was a fairy tale. Douglas and I had been married for 3 years, living in his family's sprawling estate in Millbrook Heights, an exclusive gated community where every lawn looked like a golf course and every house cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The Morrison family had old money, the kind that came with expectations, traditions, and rules I was still learning to navigate. Douglas worked in commercial real estate, following in his father's footsteps, while I taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. It wasn't glamorous work by Morrison standards, but I loved those bright faces looking up at me every morning, loved watching 8-year-olds discover that reading could transport them anywhere they wanted to go. Douglas used to joke that I was too soft-hearted for my own good, always bringing home stories about students who needed extra help or families struggling to make ends meet. The pregnancy had been planned, celebrated, perfect in every way that mattered. We'd been trying for 8 months when those 2 pink lines finally appeared on the test. Douglas cried when I showed him, actually cried, which I'd never seen him do before. We called the baby our little miracle, spent hours planning her nursery, in the tower room with the best view of the gardens. I was 7 months along when everything started to unravel, though I didn't recognize the signs at first. It began with Douglas's sister Evelyn announcing her own pregnancy at our monthly family dinner. She was only 6 weeks along, but she'd waited until we were all gathered around the massive dining room table to make her announcement, complete, with ultrasound photos and a speech about continuing the Morrison legacy. The room erupted in celebration. Champagne appeared as if by magic, though I could only sip sparkling cider. Carrie, Douglas's mother, immediately began planning baby showers and discussing nursery themes for Evelyn's child. The conversation flowed around me like I wasn't even there, like my obviously pregnant belly was somehow invisible. "Won't it be wonderful," Carrie gushed, "having 2 babies so close together? Though, Evelyn, darling, you'll want to be careful about timing. Diana's due in March, so perhaps you could aim for late summer. It would be so much easier for family planning." I felt the first flutter of something wrong in that moment, watching Evelyn's face light up as she absorbed all the attention I'd grown accustomed to receiving. For 7 months, I'd been the golden daughter-in-law, the one carrying the first Morrison grandchild. Suddenly, I felt like I was being replaced before my baby was even born. Douglas said nothing during dinner, but I caught him watching his sister with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, or relief. When we got home that night, he was quieter than usual, distracted in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety I couldn't name. "Are you happy about Evelyn's news?" I asked as we got ready for bed. "Of course," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's great, really great." But something had shifted that night, something subtle but undeniable. Over the next few weeks, Douglas became increasingly critical of everything I did. The way I arranged the nursery furniture, my choice of baby clothes. The fact that I'd gained 35 pounds instead of the 25 his mother suggested was appropriate. "You're being too emotional about everything," he said one evening when I cried after he criticized the mobile I'd chosen for the baby's room. Pregnancy hormones aren't an excuse to be irrational. The comments got sharper, more frequent. I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too focused on the baby to pay attention to his needs. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by his family's constant advice about childcare, he accused me of being ungrateful for their support. "They're just trying to help," he snapped. "But you've always been jealous of how close our family is. Now you're using the baby as an excuse to create drama." I started walking on eggshells, measuring every word, trying to be the perfect pregnant wife who never complained or asked for too much. But nothing I did seemed right anymore. When I bought a rocking chair for the nursery, he said I was being wasteful. When I didn't buy new curtains, he said I wasn't taking proper care of our home. The worst part was how isolated I felt. My own parents lived across the country, and I'd gradually lost touch with most of my friends after marrying Douglas. The Morrison family had their own social circle, their own traditions, their own ways of doing things. I'd been so grateful to be included that I'd never noticed how completely I'd been absorbed into their world, leaving nothing of my own behind. Evelyn's pregnancy progressed beautifully. She glowed in that effortless way that made everyone comment on how radiant she looked. Her morning sickness was minimal, her energy levels perfect, her mood consistently sunny. At family dinners, the conversation revolved around her cravings, her doctor's appointments, her plans for the nursery. I, meanwhile, was struggling with severe heartburn, swollen ankles, and a persistent anxiety that I couldn't shake. When I mentioned these symptoms, Carrie would smile sympathetically and suggest that perhaps I wasn't handling pregnancy as well as Evelyn because I was less naturally maternal. "Some women are just born for this," she'd say, patting Evelyn's still small bump. "Others have to work harder at it." Douglas began staying late at the office more frequently, leaving me alone in the big house with my growing anxiety and the baby furniture that somehow never seemed to be arranged correctly. When I asked him to come to my next doctor's appointment, he said he was too busy with a major deal. "Evelyn's husband Pedro makes time for all her appointments," I said, hating how petulant I sounded. "Pedro doesn't have the same responsibilities I do," Douglas replied coldly. "Maybe if you understood the pressure I'm under instead of making everything about yourself, you'd be more supportive." The night it happened, Douglas had been drinking. Not drunk, exactly, but enough that his words carried that sharp edge they got when alcohol lowered his inhibitions. Evelyn and Pedro had come for dinner, and the conversation had been entirely focused on Evelyn's plans for her baby's room, her choice of pediatrician, her decision to breastfeed exclusively. I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion, but really, I just couldn't bear another minute of feeling invisible in my own life. I was in our bedroom when the cramping started, sharp and insistent in a way that made me double over with sudden fear. The blood came next, bright red and terrifying, soaking through my nightgown faster than seemed possible. I called for Douglas, my voice cracking with panic, as the cramping intensified to a level that stole my breath. That's when he found me on the bathroom floor, hemorrhaging our daughter's life away, and instead of calling for help, he started screaming accusations that would shatter what remained of my world forever. When Douglas found me collapsed on our marble bathroom floor, surrounded by an expanding pool of blood that looked black against the white stone, his first words weren't of concern or panic. They were accusation. "What did you do?" he demanded, standing in the doorway like he was afraid to come closer. "Diana, what the hell did you do?" I couldn't answer through the waves of pain that felt like my body was trying to turn itself inside out. The cramping was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, sharp and relentless, stealing my breath with each contraction. Our daughter, we'd named her Isabella Rose after Douglas's grandmother, was dying inside me, and I could feel it happening with a clarity that would haunt me forever. "Call 911, I managed to gasp, reaching toward him with a trembling hand. "Please, Douglas, something's wrong with the baby." But instead of moving toward the phone, he stepped backward, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't process in my state of medical emergency. Shock, Yes. But underneath it was something else. Something that looked disturbingly like calculation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You did this on purpose," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone I'd learned to fear over the past few weeks. "You couldn't handle Evelyn getting attention, so you found a way to make everything about you again." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Even through the haze of pain and terror, I understood what he was suggesting. That I had somehow caused this catastrophe out of jealousy. That losing our baby was an act of spite rather than a medical emergency beyond anyone's control. "No," I whispered, but my voice was lost in another wave of cramping that made me curl into myself on the cold floor. "Please help me, please." The next few hours passed in a blur of ambulance sirens, hospital lights, and medical professionals speaking in urgent clinical terms I couldn't quite grasp. Placental abruption, fetal distress, emergency surgery. The words floated around me, like foreign language, while my body went through the motions of losing everything I'd spent 7 months dreaming about. Dr. Jennifer Blackwood, my obstetrician, explained it to me hours later when I was finally coherent enough to understand. She was a kind woman in her 50s with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too many tragedies to offer false comfort. "Sometimes these things just happen," she said softly, pulling up a chair beside my hospital bed. "Placental abruption is unpredictable. It can happen to perfectly healthy pregnancies without warning. There's nothing you could have done differently." But Douglas wasn't listening to Dr. Blackwood's explanation. He was pacing the hospital room like a caged animal, his jaw clenched with barely contained rage. When she left us alone, he turned on me with a fury that made the sterile room feel suddenly dangerous. 7 months, he said, his voice shaking with anger. 7 months of planning, of telling everyone about our daughter, of preparing the nursery. And you threw it all away, because you couldn't handle sharing the spotlight with Evelyn. I stared at him from my hospital bed, still weak from surgery and blood loss, trying to understand how the man I'd married could look at me with such contempt while I grieved our child. "I didn't do anything," I said, my voice barely audible. "The doctor said—" "The doctor has to say that," Douglas interrupted. "But I know you, Diana. I've watched you these past few weeks, getting more and more bitter every time Evelyn mentioned her pregnancy. You couldn't stand that she was handling it better than you were." The cruelty of his words was breathtaking. As I lay there, my body still recovering from emergency surgery to save my life after losing our daughter, my husband was constructing a narrative where I was the villain of our tragedy. "I loved her," I whispered, placing my hand on my now empty belly. "I loved Isabella. I wanted her more than anything." "You loved the attention," Douglas shot back. "But when Evelyn got pregnant, and suddenly you weren't the only special one anymore, you found a way to get it back, even if it meant destroying our family. That's when Carrie arrived, sweeping into the hospital room in her designer coat and clicking heels, bringing with her the particular brand of cold authority that came with decades of Morrison family influence. She took one look at me lying pale and broken in the hospital bed, then turned to her son with an expression of grim understanding. "How is she?" Carrie asked Douglas, as if I wasn't right there, as if I couldn't speak for myself. "Devastated," Douglas said, but the way he said it made it sound like a character flaw rather than a natural response to tragedy. "The doctor says it was placental abruption, but—" He let the sentence hang, pregnant with implication. Carrie's eyes narrowed slightly as she processed this information. In the 3 years I'd been part of the Morrison family, I'd learned to read the subtle signs of her disapproval. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her lips compressed into a thin line, the almost imperceptible shake of her head that conveyed disappointment without words. "Well," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of judgment, "these things happen when there's too much stress, when people aren't taking proper care of themselves." The implication was clear, even wrapped in the polite language of someone too well-bred to make direct accusations. I had caused this through some failing of character or behavior. I had not taken proper care of myself, had allowed stress to harm my pregnancy, had somehow been responsible for the medical emergency that nearly killed me. I want to go home, I said, though the word home felt foreign in my mouth. The Morrison estate had never truly felt like mine, but now it felt actively hostile, a place where I would be forever marked as the woman who couldn't even carry a pregnancy to term. The doctor wants to keep me for observation tonight, I continued, but I can go home tomorrow. Carrie and Douglas exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret, but it made something cold settle in my stomach. There was planning happening in that glance, decisions being made about my future without my input. We'll talk about that tomorrow, Douglas said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. Right now, you need to rest and think about what happened here tonight. As if I could think about anything else. As if the image of blood spreading across white marble, the feeling of our daughter slipping away from me, the sound of machines that couldn't save her, would ever leave my mind. But I was too weak to argue, too broken to fight, too devastated to realize that my husband's lack of comfort in my darkest hour was a preview of the nightmare waiting for me at home. The drive home from the hospital the next afternoon felt like a funeral procession. Douglas gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw set in that particular way that meant he was building toward an explosion. I sat in the passenger seat, still weak from surgery and blood loss, watching the familiar landmarks of Millbrook Heights blur past the window like scenes from someone else's life. The Morrison estate looked exactly the same as when I'd left in an ambulance 24 hours earlier, but everything felt different now. The perfectly manicured gardens seemed cold and sterile. The imposing stone facade looked more like a fortress than a home. Even the circular driveway with its elaborate fountain and seasonal flower arrangements felt like a stage set for a performance I no longer understood my role in. Carrie's silver Mercedes was already parked in the driveway, which meant she'd been waiting for us. Or more accurately, waiting for me. The Morrison family had their own way of handling crises, and I was beginning to understand that I was being treated like a crisis that needed to be managed rather than a daughter-in-law who needed support. Douglas didn't offer to help me out of the car, didn't carry my small overnight bag, didn't even wait for me as I walked slowly toward the front door. The incision from my emergency surgery pulled with each step, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. Inside, the house felt like a mausoleum. Carrie had arranged herself in the main sitting room, the one with the imported Italian furniture, and the oil paintings of long-dead Morrison ancestors. She was flanked by Corinne, Douglas's younger sister, and to my surprise, Evelyn and her husband Pedro. The sight of Evelyn's small but visible pregnancy bump hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been losing Isabella, life had continued for everyone else. Evelyn's baby was still growing, still healthy, still wanted. The contrast felt deliberately cruel. "Diana," Carrie said, rising from her chair with the regal bearing that came naturally to women of her generation and social class. "Come sit down. We need to have a family discussion." I looked around the room, noting the way everyone was positioned. Douglas stood behind his mother's chair like a soldier awaiting orders. Corinne perched on the edge of the sofa, her expression uncomfortable but loyal. Pedro looked genuinely sympathetic, but Evelyn wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm very tired," I said, though tired didn't begin to cover the bone-deep exhaustion that came from grieving while my body recovered from trauma. "Could we do this later?" "I'm afraid this can't wait," Carrie replied, her tone suggesting that my comfort was irrelevant to whatever agenda she'd planned. "Please, sit." It wasn't really a request. I lowered myself carefully into the wingback, chair across from her, the same chair where I'd sat countless times during family gatherings, where I'd shared news about my pregnancy, where I'd felt like I belonged. Now it felt like the defendant's chair in a courtroom. "We've been discussing what happened last night," Carrie began, folding her hands in her lap with practiced composure. "And while we're all very sorry for your loss, we need to address some concerning patterns we've been observing." My heart started beating faster, that fight-or-flight response that my body was still too weak to act on. "What patterns?" Douglas stepped forward, and I could see he'd been rehearsing this speech. "Diana, we've all noticed how you've been behaving since Evelyn announced her pregnancy. The jealousy, the mood swings, the way you've been creating drama at every family gathering." "I haven't been creating drama," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "I've been dealing with a difficult pregnancy." "See?" Corinne spoke, up for the first time, her voice carrying that particular Morrison family tone of disappointed patience. "This is exactly what we're talking about. You can't take any responsibility for your behavior." I looked around the room, trying to find an ally, someone who would acknowledge that I was a grieving mother who'd just lost her child in a medical emergency. But every face reflected varying degrees of the same judgment. "Evelyn has been handling her pregnancy beautifully," Carrie continued, gesturing toward her golden daughter-in-law. "No complaints, no drama, no attention-seeking behavior. She's been a model of maternal grace." Evelyn finally looked at me then, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't sympathy or support. It was pity mixed with something that looked disturbingly like relief, as if my tragedy had somehow validated her own success. "I think," Pedro said carefully, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, "that Diana has been through enough. Maybe we should let her rest and grieve." "Grief is natural," Douglas interrupted, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I'd grown to hate. "But using grief as an excuse for destructive behavior isn't healthy for anyone." The words hit me like a slap. Destructive behavior. As if losing my baby was something I'd done to hurt them rather than a tragedy that had happened to me. "What destructive behavior?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "I've been nothing but supportive of Evelyn's pregnancy. I've tried to be the perfect Morrison wife, the perfect daughter-in-law." "You've been jealous and bitter," Carrie stated flatly. "We've all seen it. The way you look at Evelyn, the comments you make, the way you try to redirect attention to yourself whenever she shares good news about her pregnancy. I felt like I was drowning in accusations that made no sense. Every interaction was being reframed, every moment of normal human complexity twisted into evidence of my supposed character flaws. "Yesterday morning," Douglas said, and his voice carried the weight of someone delivering a closing argument. "You complained that I wasn't paying enough attention to your doctor's appointments. You specifically mentioned that Pedro makes time for all of Evelyn's appointments, as if you were keeping score." "I just wanted my husband at my prenatal visits," I said weakly. "You wanted to compete with Evelyn," he shot back. "And when you realized you couldn't compete with how well she was handling pregnancy, you found another way to get attention." The room fell silent as the implication hung in the air like poison gas. They were suggesting, no, they were stating, outright, that I had somehow caused my own miscarriage out of jealousy and spite. "That's not true," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction because I was starting to doubt my own memories, my own motivations, my own character. This was how the Morrison family operated, I was beginning to understand, not through screaming fights or obvious cruelty, but through the slow, methodical erosion of reality, until their version of events became the only truth that mattered. And I was too weak, too grief-stricken, and too isolated to fight back against their carefully constructed narrative of my guilt. The weeks that followed revealed the true scope of what I was losing beyond just Isabella. The Morrison family operated like a well-oiled machine when it came to destroying someone from the inside out, and I was beginning to understand that this wasn't impulsive cruelty. It was systematic dismantling. Douglas moved out of our master bedroom the day after the family meeting, claiming he needed space to process his grief. But his grief looked nothing like mine. While I could barely function through waves of physical and emotional pain, he threw himself into work with renewed vigor, staying late at the office and coming home only to eat silent dinners and retreat to the guest wing. "I can't look at you right now," he said one evening when I asked if we could talk. "Every time I see you, I think about what we lost, what you cost us." The nursery remained exactly as we'd left it. Isabella's room stood as a shrine to possibilities that would never be realized. The crib Douglas had assembled while complaining about the confusing instructions. The mobile with dancing butterflies that I'd spent an hour positioning just right. The tiny clothes folded in drawers that would never be opened for their intended purpose. Carrie had offered to help by having everything removed and the room converted back to a guest space. But something in me rebelled against that final erasure. As long as Isabella's things remained, some part of her existence felt real. Some proof remained that I hadn't imagined the 7 months of loving her, planning for her, dreaming about her future. But keeping the nursery intact became another weapon in their arsenal of psychological warfare. "It's not healthy," Douglas said, finding me sitting in the rocking chair one afternoon, holding the teddy bear we'd bought during our first shopping trip for baby items. "This obsession with maintaining a shrine isn't helping you move forward." "I'm grieving," I said quietly. "Dr. Blackwood said this was normal." "Dr. Blackwood doesn't have to live with it," he replied coldly. "She doesn't have to walk past this room every day and be reminded of your failure. My failure." The words landed like physical blows, but by then I'd heard variations of them so often that they were starting to feel like truth. Maybe I had failed. Maybe there was something I could have done differently. Maybe other women like Evelyn, wouldn't have lost their babies to medical emergencies. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part. My teaching position at Millbrook Elementary had been understanding about my medical leave, but when I tried to return 3 weeks after losing Isabella, Douglas forbade it. "You're not emotionally stable enough to be around children," he declared. "What if you have another breakdown at school? What if you say something inappropriate to the kids about death or loss? You could traumatize them." The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but once he planted the seed, it grew into a full-blown fear. What if I did break down in front of my third graders? What if my grief leaked out in ways that harmed the children I loved teaching? I called in for an extended leave of absence, cutting myself off from the one environment where I'd always felt competent and valued. My students sent me a card they'd all signed, with drawings of flowers and hearts and messages in careful 8-year-old handwriting. "We miss you, Mrs. Morrison. Come back soon. We love you." Douglas threw the card away without letting me read all the messages. "You need to focus on healing," he said, "not dwelling on things that will keep you stuck in the past." My friends from school tried to visit, but Douglas discouraged them with polite but firm explanations about my fragile emotional state. Soon the calls stopped coming. The invitations to coffee dates dried up. Even my closest colleague, Sarah Martinez, eventually stopped reaching out after several canceled plans and unreturned calls. The Morrison family's social circle was more complicated to navigate. These were people who'd known Douglas his entire life, who had business relationships with his father, who moved in the same exclusive circles. When they asked about the pregnancy, Douglas's response was consistent and devastating. "Diana's having a difficult time," he would say with just the right note of concerned husband in his voice. "The loss hit her very hard. We're hoping she'll get the help she needs." The implication was clear without being legally actionable. Diana was unstable. Diana was not handling things well. Diana might need professional help for problems that went beyond normal grief. When Evelyn's baby shower invitations went out 6 weeks after I lost Isabella, I wasn't invited. Carrie delivered this news with characteristic bluntness. "We thought it might be too difficult for you," she said, though her tone suggested she thought it might be too difficult for everyone else to have me there. "Evelyn wants to celebrate," her blessing without any negative energy affecting the gathering. I watched from the upstairs window as cars filled our circular driveway, as women in pastel dresses carried prettily wrapped packages into our home for a celebration I was specifically excluded from, the same home where I'd planned my own baby shower, where I'd imagined introducing Isabella to the family who was now treating her memory like a contagious disease. The sound of laughter drifted up from the gardens where they'd set up tables under the oak trees. The same trees where I'd imagined pushing Isabella in a stroller, where I'd planned to teach her to climb and explore. That night, I understood for the first time that I wasn't just grieving my daughter. I was grieving my entire life, my identity, my place in the world. The Morrison family had systematically stripped away everything that made me feel human, leaving me floating in a void of blame and isolation. And the worst part was beginning to understand that this wasn't the bottom. This was just preparation for something even more devastating to come. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in February, exactly 2 months after I lost Isabella. Evelyn was now 4 months pregnant and glowing with the kind of effortless radiance that seemed to mock my own hollow-eyed reflection in every mirror. She'd stopped by the house after her latest doctor's appointment, practically floating with excitement about finding out the baby's gender. "It's a boy," she announced to the family gathered in the main sitting room, her hands cradling her rounded belly with protective joy. "Pedro is over the moon. We're going to name him Alexander Douglas Morrison Rivera, after Grandpa and Douglas." The room erupted in celebration. Carrie actually clapped her hands together like a delighted child. Corinne squealed and immediately began planning a gender reveal party. Douglas smiled wider than I'd seen him smile since before Isabella died, crossing the room to embrace his sister with genuine warmth. "Alexander Douglas," he repeated, and there was pride in his voice that cut through me like glass. "I'm honored, Evelyn. Really honored." I sat in my usual chair, the defendant's chair as I'd come to think of it, watching this celebration of new life while the ghost of my own lost child seemed to hover in the room like an unwelcome presence. The irony wasn't lost on me that Evelyn's son would carry Douglas's name, while our daughter, who should have been the first grandchild, had been reduced to a cautionary tale about unstable women who couldn't handle pregnancy properly. "Diana," Carrie said, turning to me with that brittle smile she reserved for moments when she wanted to appear magnanimous. "Isn't this wonderful news? Another blessing for our family?" The word blessing hit me like a physical blow. If Evelyn's pregnancy was a blessing, what did that make Isabella's death? A curse? A punishment? Evidence of divine judgment on my character? "Wonderful," I managed to say, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "You seem upset," Evelyn said, and there was something in her tone that made the room go quiet. Not concern, something sharper, more calculating. "I hope our good news isn't bringing up difficult feelings for you." The question hung in the air, like a trap. If I said yes, I was admitting to the jealousy they'd been accusing me of for months. If I said no, I was lying, and they all knew it. "I'm happy for you," I said carefully. I miss Isabella." "Of course you do," Douglas said, but his tone carried that familiar edge of impatience. "But dwelling on what happened isn't healthy, Diana. You need to focus on moving forward, on supporting the family we still have." The family we still have. As if Isabella had never been part of the family. As if her 7 months in my womb, our months of planning and dreaming and loving her, counted for nothing because she'd never taken a breath outside my body. "Maybe," Corinne suggested with false brightness, "Diana could help plan the nursery for Alexander? It might be therapeutic, to focus on new life instead of—" She caught herself before finishing the sentence, but we all knew what she meant to say. Instead of death, instead of failure, instead of the tragedy I'd brought upon myself. "That's a lovely idea," Carrie agreed immediately. "Diana has experience with nursery planning, after all." The cruelty of it took my breath away. They wanted me to plan a nursery for Evelyn's healthy, wanted baby, while Isabella's room sat untouched down the hall. They wanted me to celebrate the life that survived while pretending the life I'd lost had never mattered. "I don't think I can do that," I said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Douglas's jaw clenched in that way that meant his patience was exhausted. Carrie's smile became predatory. Even Pedro, who'd remained largely silent through these family dynamics, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "And why not?" Douglas asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Because it would hurt too much," I said honestly. "Because I'm still grieving my daughter, and I can't pretend that I'm not." "There it is," Carrie said with satisfaction, as if I'd just confessed to a crime. "The selfishness we've been trying to address. Even when faced with joyful news about a healthy pregnancy, you make it about your own pain." "I'm not making it about me," I protested, but my voice was shaking now. "I'm just trying to be honest about what I can and can't handle right now." "You can't handle anything," Douglas exploded, his careful composure finally cracking. "You can't handle normal family celebrations. You can't handle other people's happiness. You can't handle being a supportive wife or sister-in-law. All you can handle is wallowing in self-pity and making everyone else miserable." The words hit me like physical blows. 2 months of grief, isolation, and systematic emotional abuse had worn down my defenses until I had nothing left to protect myself with. "I lost my baby," I whispered. "I lost our daughter. How am I supposed to just move on like that never happened?" "Our daughter?" Douglas's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the expensive wallpaper and imported fixtures. "Our daughter? You killed our daughter with your jealousy and spite, and now you want sympathy for your loss?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. In that moment, I understood that this had all been leading to this confession. This moment when Douglas would finally say out loud what they'd all been thinking for months. I had killed my own child. In their version of reality, Isabella's death wasn't a medical tragedy. It was murder by maternal inadequacy. And looking around the room at their faces, I realized they all believed it. Every single one of them had accepted this narrative as truth. And I was the only one left who remembered that I was a grieving mother rather than a baby killer. That's when I understood I wasn't just losing my family. I was losing my grip on reality itself. What happened next unfolded with the terrible precision of a nightmare that felt both inevitable and impossible. Douglas's accusation that I had killed our daughter hung in the air for exactly 3 heartbeats before something in his face shifted from anger to something far more dangerous. "Get out," he said, his voice dropping to that whisper-quiet tone that had always terrified me more than his shouting. "Get out of my house. Get out of my family. Get out of my life." I stood on trembling legs, still weak from surgery and months of grief, my body moving on autopilot toward the door. But before I could take more than 2 steps, Corinne was there, blocking my path with her small but determined frame. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, and there was something predatory in her voice that made my blood turn to ice. "Douglas told me to leave," I said, confused by the contradiction. "Oh, you're leaving," Carrie said, rising from her chair, with the fluid grace of a woman who had orchestrated this moment carefully. "But first, we need to make sure you understand the consequences of what you've done to this family." That's when I noticed Pedro quietly slipping out of the room, his face pale with what looked like genuine fear. He caught my eye for just a moment, and I saw something that might have been sympathy before he disappeared into the hallway. Even Evelyn's husband, who had always been kind to me, wasn't going to intervene in whatever the Morrison family had planned. Evelyn remained seated, one hand protectively cradling her belly, watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly entertaining television show. Her presence felt like another form of torture, the healthy, pregnant woman watching the broken one get destroyed. "Corinne, hold her arms," Douglas said with the casual tone of someone giving instructions about moving furniture. The words didn't register at first. Hold my arms? Why would... Then Corinne's hands were on me, her fingers digging into my upper arms with surprising strength for someone so petite. I tried to pull away, but she tightened her grip, her manicured nails finding the tender spots where IV needles had left bruises during my hospital stay. "What are you doing?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice as I realized I couldn't break free from her hold. "Teaching you a lesson about consequences," Carrie said, moving to my other side. Her hands pressed down on my shoulders with the kind of practiced pressure that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd helped restrain someone. "About what happens when you destroy something precious." I looked desperately toward Evelyn, silently, begging for help, for intervention, for any acknowledgement that what was happening wasn't normal family conflict resolution. But she just shifted in her chair to get a better view, her hand still resting on her pregnant belly like a shield. Douglas stood in front of me now, his face transformed by a rage so complete it seemed to consume everything human about him. This wasn't the man I'd married, wasn't the man who had once cried when I showed him positive pregnancy tests. This was someone else entirely, someone capable of violence I'd never imagined. "You took away my daughter," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "You took away my chance to be a father to Isabella because you couldn't handle sharing attention with Evelyn. So now you're going to understand what loss really feels like." The first kick landed just below my left breast, driving all the air from my lungs and sending fire through my already tender surgical incision. I doubled over instinctively, but Corinne and Carrie's grip kept me upright, kept me vulnerable to whatever came next. "Douglas, please," I gasped, but the words came out as barely a whisper. The second kick caught me in the stomach, in the exact spot where Isabella had grown for 7 months. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Nothing about this assault was random or impulsive. This was calculated punishment designed to destroy me in the most psychologically devastating way possible. Pain exploded through my core, radiating outward in waves that made my vision blur. I could taste blood in my mouth, though I wasn't sure if I'd bitten my tongue or if something internal had torn. "That's enough," Evelyn said suddenly, but her voice carried more annoyance than concern. "I don't want to watch this anymore. It's upsetting the baby." As if my physical assault was an inconvenience to her viewing pleasure rather than a violent crime happening in front of her. Douglas stepped back, breathing hard, his expensive shoes spotted with drops of blood that had fallen from my mouth. He looked at me with something that might have been satisfaction, as if he'd finally found a way to make his pain feel manageable by transferring it to my body. "Get her out of here," he said to his mother and sister. "I don't want to see her face again." But I could barely stand, let alone walk. The pain in my abdomen was excruciating, and I was bleeding again, not just from my mouth, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that the kicks had damaged in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. Corinne. And Carrie half-dragged, half-carried me toward the front door, my feet barely able to support my weight. The marble foyer, with its imported Italian stone and crystal chandelier, blurred past in a haze of pain and shock. The February air hit my skin like a slap when they pushed me outside. I was wearing only the thin sweater and yoga pants I'd put on that morning, never imagining I'd end up bleeding on the front steps of what had been my home for 3 years. "Don't come back," Carrie said as she closed the door with a decisive click that echoed in the cold night air. I collapsed on the stone steps, my body finally giving in to the trauma of the assault and the months of psychological abuse that had led to this moment. Blood from my mouth dripped onto the pristine white stone, creating dark stains that would probably be power washed away by morning, erasing all evidence of what had happened here. The automatic sprinkler system activated as I lay there, soaking me with icy water that mixed with my blood and tears, washing away the last remnants of my identity as a Morrison family member. I was nobody now, nothing now, Just a broken woman bleeding on expensive stone steps in an exclusive neighborhood where no one would think to look for victims. I don't remember how I got from the Morrison estate to St. Mary's Hospital. The next clear memory I have is waking up in a sterile white room that smelled like disinfectant and floor wax, with machines beeping softly around me and an IV needle taped to my hand. Later, I learned that a jogger had found me unconscious on the sidewalk 3 blocks from the house, hypothermic and bleeding, and called 911. The emergency room doctor, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Angela Foster, explained my injuries with clinical detachment. Bruised ribs, internal bleeding that required minor surgery, mild hypothermia from exposure, a concussion from where my head had hit the stone steps when I collapsed. The pattern of bruising suggests you were kicked repeatedly in the torso, she said, making notes on my chart. Do you want to tell me what happened? I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the little holes in the acoustic panels, and said nothing. What was I supposed to say? That my husband's family had beaten me up for losing my baby? That they'd thrown me out of the house for grieving incorrectly? The story sounded insane, even in my own head. Diana, Dr. Foster said gently, pulling up a chair beside my bed. I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what domestic violence looks like. There are people who can help you. Resources. I fell down some stairs, I said, the lie tasting like metal in my mouth. I've been clumsy since my surgery. Still recovering. She didn't believe me, but she couldn't force me to tell the truth. After 48 hours of observation, they discharged me with pain medication, anti-obstructions for wound care, and a business card for a women's shelter that I threw away in the hospital parking lot. I had nowhere to go. My parents lived in Oregon, 3,000 miles away, and the thought of explaining what had happened to them felt impossible. My former colleagues at the school thought I was on medical leave for grief counseling. My few friends had been gradually pushed away by months of canceled plans and unreturned calls. The Morrison family had succeeded in isolating me so completely that when I needed help most, I had no one to turn to. I ended up at the Riverside Motel, a rundown establishment near the highway that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask too many questions about guests who paid in cash. My room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the parking lot where big rigs idled through the night. The carpet was brown with suspicious stains, the bathroom had a leak that dripped constantly into a plastic bucket, and the heater made rattling sounds that kept me awake. But it was mine. For the first time in months, I was in a space where no one was watching me, judging me, or waiting for me to break down so they could point out my failures. The silence was profound and terrifying and oddly comforting. I spent the first week sleeping 16 hours a day, my body finally catching up on months of stress and trauma. When I was awake, I sat by the window watching traffic on the highway, trucks carrying goods to destinations I'd never seen, people traveling toward lives I couldn't imagine. The pain medication helped with my physical injuries, but it did nothing for the deeper damage. I would wake up reaching for Isabella, forgetting for just a moment that she was gone. I would catch myself planning to call Douglas about some mundane household issue before remembering that I no longer had a household, a husband, or a life that included him. The worst part was the silence in my own head. For months, the Morrison family had filled my mind with their voices, their judgments, their version of reality. Now, alone in this shabby motel room, I had to figure out what I actually thought about what had happened to me. Had I been jealous of Evelyn? Sometimes, maybe. Was that normal? I thought it probably was. Had I caused my miscarriage through negative emotions? The rational part of my mind knew that was impossible, but the rest of me wasn't sure anymore. On day 10, I called, "My parents! Diana!" My mother's voice exploded through the phone with relief and love that I'd almost forgotten existed. "Honey, we've been so worried. Douglas said you were in intensive therapy and couldn't have contact with anyone, but it's been 2 months." Douglas had been managing my relationships even after throwing me out, controlling the narrative about my absence to ensure I remained isolated. "Mom," I said, and then I started crying. Not the careful, quiet tears I'd learned to shed around the Morrison family, but huge, ugly sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. "Baby, what's wrong? What happened?" I told her everything. The miscarriage, the blame, the isolation, the assault, the motel room. Words poured out of me like water from a broken dam, 2 months of silence breaking all at once. "We're coming," she said, when I finally stopped talking. "Your father and I are getting on a plane tonight." "Don't go anywhere, don't do anything, just wait for us. It's 3,000 miles. I don't care if it's 3 million miles, my mother said fiercely. "You're our daughter, and no one treats our daughter like that. We're coming." 4. The first time since losing Isabella, I felt like I might survive this, not because the pain was less, but because someone who loved me was coming to help me carry it. I wasn't alone anymore. My parents arrived at the Riverside Motel like a rescue team, my father's face grim with barely contained rage, while my mother immediately wrapped me in the kind of hug that felt like coming home after years of being lost. They took one look at the dingy room with its stained carpet and leaking ceiling, packed my few belongings, and drove me straight to a furnished apartment they'd rented across town. "This is temporary," my mother Linda said as she helped me settle into the clean, bright space with its modern furniture and working appliances. "Just until you're strong enough to decide what comes next." My father, Robert, was less diplomatic about his feelings. "That family belongs in prison," he said, his voice shaking with fury as he examined the fading bruises on my ribs. "We're pressing charges. We're calling lawyers. We're making sure they pay for what they did to you." But I wasn't ready for battles or justice. I was barely ready to exist in the world without falling apart. The simple act of choosing what to eat for breakfast felt overwhelming when I'd spent months having every decision questioned, criticized, or made for me. "I just want to disappear for a while," I told them. "I just want to remember who I was before all this happened." They stayed for 2 weeks, helping me establish routines that had nothing to do with the Morrison family's expectations. My mother cooked meals I actually enjoyed, instead of the elaborate, formal dinners Carrie had insisted were appropriate for family gatherings. My father helped me set up a small workspace where I could pursue the digital art I'd abandoned during my marriage. More importantly, they talked to me like I was a rational adult capable of making decisions about my own life. When I said I wasn't ready to see a therapist, they didn't argue or suggest I was avoiding necessary healing. When I admitted I was scared to leave the apartment alone, they offered to accompany me instead of telling me my fears were irrational. "Healing isn't linear," my mother said one evening as we sat on the small balcony watching sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "After your father's accident, it took him months to feel safe driving again. And that was just a broken leg. What you went through was so much worse. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged that trauma takes time to heal, that my reactions were normal responses to abnormal circumstances rather than character flaws that needed to be corrected." After my parents returned to Oregon, I began the slow work of rebuilding my sense of self. I started with small things, choosing my own clothes without wondering if they met Morrison family standards, eating meals at whatever time I felt hungry instead of adhering to formal dining schedules, listening to music I enjoyed instead of the classical compositions Carrie considered appropriate background for cultivated conversation. Dr. Sarah Kim, the therapist I eventually found the courage to see, had an office filled with plants and natural light that felt nothing like the sterile, intimidating spaces I'd imagined. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a direct manner that cut through nonsense without being harsh. "You've been gaslighted," she explained during our 3rd session, using a term I'd never heard before. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation where someone makes you question your own reality, your own memories, your own sanity. It's a common tactic in abusive relationships. She gave me books to read about emotional abuse, about trauma recovery, about the ways manipulative people systematically break down their victims' sense of reality. For the first time, I had language for what had happened to me that didn't center on my supposed failures or character defects. The miscarriage wasn't your fault, Dr. Kim said firmly during our 5th session. Placental abruption is a medical emergency that happens to healthy pregnancies. Emotional stress doesn't cause it. Jealousy doesn't cause it. Being human and having complex feelings about your sister-in-law's pregnancy doesn't cause it. Hearing those words from a medical professional felt like being handed back a piece of my sanity I'd thought was lost forever. I started small projects to rebuild my confidence. I volunteered at the local animal shelter, walking dogs who were grateful for attention without judging my emotional fitness for the task. I took online courses in graphic design to update skills I'd let atrophy during my marriage. I painted watercolor landscapes that no one else had to approve or critique. Slowly, carefully, I began to remember who Diana had been before she became Mrs. Morrison. She'd been someone who loved teaching children, who created beautiful things with her hands, who had opinions about books and movies and politics that didn't require approval from anyone else. She'd been imperfect and human and worthy of love exactly as she was. The hardest part was learning to trust my own judgment again. After months of being told my perceptions were wrong, my emotions were inappropriate, and my reactions were evidence of instability, making even simple decisions felt terrifying. What if I was wrong? What if my judgment really was as flawed as Douglas and his family had claimed? Start with things that only affect you, Dr. Kim suggested. Choose a restaurant for lunch. Pick a movie to watch. Buy a plant for your apartment. Practice trusting yourself with low-stakes decisions until you remember that your judgment is as valid as anyone else's. It was revolutionary, the idea that I didn't need permission to trust my own mind. 6 months into my recovery, I started venturing beyond the safe boundaries of my apartment, therapy sessions, and volunteer work at the animal shelter. Dr. Kim had suggested I try joining some kind of group activity, a book club, an art class, something that would help me practice social interaction in a low-pressure environment. I chose a community pottery class that met Thursday evenings at the local arts center. Something about working with clay appealed to me. The idea of creating something beautiful from raw material, of being able to start over if things went wrong. The class was small, just 8 people ranging in age from college students to retirees, all gathered around pottery wheels in a bright studio that smelled like earth and creativity. That's where I met Ander. He was the instructor, a man in his early 30s with gentle hands and paint-stained fingers, the kind of person who moved through the world with quiet confidence rather than demanding attention. His approach to teaching was patient and encouraging, focused on the process rather than perfection. "The clay will tell you what it wants to become," he said during my first class, watching me struggle with a lopsided bowl that kept collapsing. "Your job isn't to force it into a specific shape, but to guide it toward its best possible form." The metaphor wasn't lost on me. After months of being told I was fundamentally flawed and needed to be reshaped according to someone else's specifications, the idea that something could be guided rather than forced felt revolutionary. Ander never asked probing questions about my life or why a woman my age was taking beginner pottery classes. He simply taught, offered gentle corrections when my technique needed adjustment, and celebrated small victories when my bowls started staying upright. The other class members were equally accepting. There was Margaret, a retired librarian who'd always wanted to try pottery, David, a college student working on art therapy techniques, and Rosa, a nurse who came to class directly from 12-hour shifts, still wearing scrubs and looking exhausted but determined to create something beautiful with her hands. These people didn't know about my past, didn't have opinions about my character or judgment about my choices. To them, I was simply Diana, the woman who was learning to center clay and who brought homemade cookies to share during break time. "You're getting really good at this," Rosa commented one evening as I pulled a successful mug from the kiln. "Look, At those clean lines, you're a natural. The compliment hit me unexpectedly hard. When was the last time someone had praised my abilities without qualification or comparison to someone else? When had anyone last suggested I was naturally good at something? After class, I often lingered to help clean up, partly because I enjoyed the peaceful ritual of organizing tools and cleaning workstations, but mostly because I wasn't ready to return to my empty apartment. Ander seemed to understand this without explanation, allowing me to putter around the studio while he prepared for the next day's classes. "You don't have to stay to help," he said one evening as I swept clay shavings from the floor. "But I appreciate the company. I like being useful," I said, realizing as I spoke that it was true. The Morrison family had made me feel like a burden, someone whose presence required constant management and correction. Here in the pottery studio, my help was welcomed without strings attached. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" Ander asked as we finished closing up the studio one Thursday evening. "There's a place near here that makes excellent cappuccinos, and I'd enjoy continuing our conversation about glazing techniques somewhere with better lighting." The invitation was casual, friendly, completely free of the aggressive charm or calculated interest I'd learned to fear from men. This was simply one person asking another if they'd like to spend time together. "I'd like that," I said, surprised by how natural the words felt. Our first coffee meeting lasted 3 hours. We talked about art, about the satisfaction of creating something with your hands, about his background as a sculptor who'd found his calling in teaching. He told me about his studio space in an old warehouse district where he created large ceramic installations for galleries and public spaces. I found myself sharing stories about my teaching days, about the joy of watching 8-year-olds discover new concepts, about the satisfaction of helping someone understand something they'd thought was impossible. "You light up when you talk about teaching," Ander observed, stirring sugar into his second cappuccino. "Do you miss it?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on surviving, on healing, on basic day-to-day functioning, that I hadn't considered what I actually missed from my life before the Morrison family destroyed it. "Yes," I said, realizing it was true. "I miss feeling useful in a way that mattered. I miss being good at something important." "Teaching is incredibly important," he said simply. "And from the way you describe your students, you are clearly gifted at it. Have you thought about going back?" The idea felt both terrifying and exciting. Return to teaching? Trust myself with children again? Believe that I could be competent and valuable in a professional setting? "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted. "That's okay," Ander said, and his acceptance of my uncertainty felt like a gift. Readiness isn't something you can force. But when you are ready, I think those kids would be lucky to have you. It was the first time in over a year that someone had suggested I might have something valuable to offer the world, that my presence might be a positive force rather than a problem to be managed. The test of my healing came unexpectedly on a Saturday morning in September, nearly 8 months after I'd crawled bleeding from the Morrison estate. I was at the farmer's market with Ander, examining heirloom tomatoes and debating the merits of different varieties for the pasta sauce we planned to make together that evening, when I heard a voice that made my blood turn to ice. "Diana? Diana. Morrison?" I turned to see Claire Patterson, a woman I'd known from Millbrook Elementary where we'd both taught 3rd grade. She was pushing a stroller containing a toddler who was happily gnawing on a teething ring, her face bright with the kind of surprised delight that comes from unexpected encounters with old friends. "Oh my goodness, it is you," Claire continued, approaching with the enthusiasm of someone who had no idea she was walking into a minefield. "I haven't seen you since you took your leave of absence. How are you? How's married life treating you?" The world seemed to tilt sideways. In the safe bubble I'd created over the past months, I'd almost forgotten that there was a whole community of people who knew me as Mrs. Morrison, who had no idea that my marriage had ended in violence and exile. People who might ask innocent questions that could shatter the fragile peace I'd built. I started, then found myself unable to continue. My throat closed up, my hands started shaking, and suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. The familiar signs of a panic attack that I'd thought were behind me. Ander was beside me immediately, his hand gentle on my back, his voice calm and steady. "Diana, you're okay. You're safe. Just breathe with me." But Claire was still talking, oblivious to my distress, chattering about school gossip and asking about Douglas and wondering if I was planning to return to teaching next semester. Each question felt like a physical blow, dragging me back into a version of myself I'd worked so hard to escape. "I need to go," I managed to gasp, backing away from Claire's confused face and concerned questions. "Diana, wait. Did I say something wrong? You look upset." But I was already fleeing, pushing through the crowd of market-goers with Ander close behind me. I made it to his truck before the full panic attack hit, doubling over in the passenger seat as my body remembered the terror of being trapped in a world where my every response was wrong, where kindness was a trap, where normal conversations were loaded with hidden threats. "I'm sorry," I sobbed as Ander drove us away from the market. "I'm sorry. I thought I was better. I thought I could handle normal things like running into people." "Hey," he said firmly, pulling into an empty parking lot and turning to face me. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. You had a panic attack because something triggered your trauma. That doesn't mean you're not healing. It doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human." His calm acceptance of my breakdown was so different from what I'd experienced with the Morrison family that it almost triggered another wave of panic. Where was the impatience? The suggestion that I was being dramatic? The insistence that I should be over this by now? "But I embarrassed you," I said, wiping my nose with the tissues he handed me from the glove compartment. "Claire probably thinks you're dating some kind of crazy person, Diana." His voice was gentle but firm. "I don't care what Claire thinks. I care about you. And right now, you're in pain, which means my job is to help you feel safe, not to worry about what strangers..." Think of our relationship. The word relationship hung in the air between us. We'd been seeing each other for 3 months, spending 2 or 3 evenings a week together, sharing meals and long conversations and slowly building something that felt precious and fragile. But we'd never defined what we were to each other, never discussed where things were heading. "Is that what this is?" I asked quietly. "A relationship?" Ander was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I'd like it to be," he said finally, "but only if that feels right to you. Only if you want it to be." The fact that he was asking rather than assuming, that he was giving me choice and agency in defining our connection, made something tight in my chest begin to loosen. "I want it to be," I said, "but I'm scared. I'm scared that I'm too damaged, that I'll have more days like this, that I'll drag you down into my mess." "Diana," he said, reaching for my hand with the same careful gentleness he used when guiding clay on the pottery wheel. "You're not a mess. You're a woman who survived something terrible and is working incredibly hard to heal from it. Your strength amazes me every day. Even when I fall apart in farmers' market parking lots?" "Especially then," he said seriously, "because falling apart and getting back up is one of the bravest things a person can do. And you always get back up." That evening, instead of making pasta sauce, we sat on his couch while I told him everything. The whole story, from Isabella's death through the assault to my parents' rescue to the slow work of rebuilding my life. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix me or offer solutions, just holding space for my pain and my healing. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said when I finished. "And thank you for letting me be part of your recovery." For the first time since losing Isabella, I felt like I wasn't carrying my trauma alone. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 year after losing Isabella. I was in Anders' studio, helping him prepare clay for a large installation piece, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. Diana, this is Michelle Crawford from Riverside Elementary School. The voice was warm and professional, carrying the particular energy that came from people who worked with children. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the substitute teacher database. We have a situation here, and frankly, you're exactly what we need. My hand stilled on the clay I'd been wedging. Riverside Elementary was across town from Millbrook, in a more diverse neighborhood where many of the families struggled financially. I'd heard about their programs for at-risk kids, their innovative approaches to helping children who came from difficult circumstances. I'm not sure I understand, I said carefully. We just lost our third-grade teacher to a family emergency. She had to move across the country to care for her elderly mother. It's mid-semester, which is terrible timing, but these kids desperately need consistency and someone who truly cares about their education. Michelle paused. Your former principal at Millbrook, Dr. Roberts, gave you the highest recommendation I've ever heard. She said you were the most naturally gifted teacher she'd worked with in 30 years. Dr. Roberts had said that about me? The woman whose approval I'd always sought, who'd been genuinely disappointed when I'd taken my leave of absence, thought I was gifted? The position would start after Thanksgiving break, Michelle continued. I know it's short notice, and I know you've been away from teaching for a while, but these kids need someone special. Would you be willing to at least come in and meet them? I looked at Anders, who was listening with barely concealed excitement, and realized that for the first time in over a year, I felt genuinely excited about something. Not just hopeful or cautiously optimistic, but truly excited. Yes, I said before I could second-guess myself. I'd love to meet them. The interview felt less like a job evaluation and more like a homecoming. Michelle showed me around the bright, cheerful classrooms filled with student artwork and reading corners that invited exploration. The hallways buzzed with the particular energy of children engaged in learning, and I felt something in my chest that had been dormant for months suddenly wake up. The third-grade classroom that would be mine was a disaster. The previous teacher had left in such a hurry that student work was still scattered across desks, half-finished projects abandoned on shelves, and the reading corner looked like a tornado had hit it. I know it's overwhelming, Michelle said apologetically. If you take the position, we'll give you a week before the kids come back to get organized. But I wasn't overwhelmed. I was energized. I could see the potential in this chaotic space, could envision how it would look when properly arranged for learning and discovery. This wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a canvas waiting for the right artist. When can I start? I asked. The week I spent preparing the classroom was pure joy. I arrived early each morning and stayed late into the evening, transforming the space into something magical. I created reading nooks with soft cushions and good lighting. I organized learning centers that would allow kids to explore concepts through hands-on activities. I hung student work on the walls and created displays that celebrated learning rather than perfection. Anders helped me move furniture and hang decorations, marveling at my transformation from tentative survivor to confident educator. You're like a completely different person when you're in teacher mode, he observed as we arranged desks in collaborative clusters rather than traditional rows. You know exactly what you're doing, and you do it with such confidence. He was right. In this classroom, surrounded by the tools of learning and the promise of young minds to nurture, I remembered who I'd been before the Morrison family tried to convince me I was fundamentally flawed. I was someone who had valuable skills, important work to do, and gifts to share with the world. When I met my new students on that first Monday morning, I knew I'd found my way home. 22 third graders with 22 different stories, challenges, and dreams. Kids like Marcus, who read at a kindergarten level but had an intuitive understanding of math that amazed me. Like Sophia, whose parents worked 3 jobs between them, but who wrote poetry that could make you cry. Like James, who'd been labeled a behavior problem, but who just needed someone to recognize that his energy could be channeled into leadership rather than disruption. These children didn't know about my past trauma or the family that had rejected me. To them, I was simply Ms. Diana, the teacher who made learning fun, who listened to their problems, who believed they were capable of amazing things. Within a month, test scores in my classroom were improving. More importantly, the kids were excited about learning again. They rushed into class each morning, eager to see what new adventure we'd embark on together. Principal Crawford stopped by one afternoon to observe a science lesson where we were exploring the water cycle by creating miniature weather systems in mason jars. "This is exactly what I hoped would happen," she said after watching my students work together with enthusiasm and focus. "You've brought something special to this school, Diana. The kids adore you, and more importantly, they're learning." That evening, I called my parents to share the news of my success. "I'm so proud of you," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've not only survived what they did to you, you've thrived. You've found your way back to who you were meant to be." For the first time since losing Isabella, I felt like I had a future worth building. The disruption to my carefully rebuilt life came on a Thursday afternoon in March, almost exactly 2 years after I'd been thrown bleeding onto the Morrison estate steps. I was in my classroom helping Marcus with a reading assignment when Principal Crawford appeared in my doorway with an expression I'd never seen before. Part confusion, part concern, and something that looked almost like fear. "Diana, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral in the way administrators used when dealing with delicate situations. I guided Marcus to the reading corner and followed Michelle into the hallway, my stomach already clenching with intuitive dread. In the months since I'd started teaching at Riverside, nothing had threatened the peaceful bubble I'd created around my new life. What could possibly— "There's a man here to see you," Michelle said quietly, glancing around to make sure no students were within earshot. "He says he's your husband, Douglas Morrison." The name hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process how my carefully separated past and present had suddenly collided in the hallway of my elementary school. "My ex-husband," I corrected automatically, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "We've been divorced for over a year." Michelle's eyebrows rose slightly. "He seemed very insistent about needing to speak with you. He's waiting in my office." "Diana, if you're not comfortable—" "Where did he come from?" I interrupted, trying to understand how Douglas had found me. I'd been so careful to keep my new life separate from anything connected to the Morrison family. I'd used my maiden name at school, lived in a different part of town, avoided places where I might encounter anyone from my previous social circle. "He said he's been looking for you for months," Michelle replied, her administrator's training helping her stay calm while clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "He mentioned something about important legal documents that need your signature." Legal documents. My mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened? To one of the Morrison family members? Was there some piece of our divorce that hadn't been properly finalized? Or was this simply another manipulation, another way to exert control over the life I'd built without them? "I don't have to see him," I said, more to myself than to Michelle. Dr. Kim had been very clear about this during our sessions. I always had a choice. I could choose to engage or not engage. I could set boundaries. I could protect my peace. "Absolutely not," Michelle agreed firmly. "I can ask him to leave or have security escort him out if necessary. You don't owe anyone access to you, especially not during school hours." But even as she spoke, I could see Douglas through the glass windows of the main office. He looked different than I remembered. Thinner, older, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during our marriage. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, but it hung loosely on his frame, as if he'd lost significant weight. He was pacing the small office space with the same restless energy I remembered from our worst fights, checking his watch and glancing toward the hallway where he knew I'd eventually appear. The sight of him in this building, in my sanctuary, felt like a violation of the sacred space I'd created for healing. "Ms. Diana?" Marcus appeared at my elbow, his small face creased with concern. "Are you okay? You look sad." The innocent observation from my student snapped me back to reality. I was standing in the hallway of an elementary school, letting the ghost of my abusive past overshadow the present moment with a child who trusted me to be his teacher, his advocate, his safe adult. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, crouching down to his eye level. "Just dealing with some grown-up stuff. Why don't you go work on that math worksheet we started yesterday? I'll be back in a few minutes." Marcus nodded and skipped back toward the classroom, satisfied with my explanation in the way that only children could be. His easy acceptance of my reassurance reminded me how far I'd come, how different this version of myself was from the broken woman who'd once cowered under Morrison family accusations. "I'll see him," I said to Michelle, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "But only for a few minutes, and only with you present." Michelle nodded. "Of course. And Diana? If at any point you want him to leave, just say the word." As we walked toward the main office, I caught sight of myself in the reflection of the trophy case windows. The woman looking back at me was someone I almost didn't recognize. Confident, purposeful, wearing a cheerful sweater covered in painted handprints from my student's art project. This wasn't the trembling victim Douglas had last seen bleeding on his family's doorstep. I was Ms. Diana now, a teacher beloved by her students, respected by her colleagues, building a life filled with meaning and joy. Whatever Douglas wanted, whatever crisis or manipulation had brought him here, he was walking into my world now, my territory, my strength. The realization gave me courage I didn't know I possessed. I straightened my shoulders, took a deep breath, and prepared to face the man who had once made me question my sanity, my worth, and my right to exist. This time, I wasn't broken. This time, I wasn't alone. This time, I had something worth protecting, and I'd learned how to fight for it. Douglas Morrison was about to discover that the woman he'd destroyed no longer existed. In her place stood someone infinitely stronger, and he had no power over her anymore. The conversation with Douglas lasted exactly 12 minutes, during which he alternated between desperate apologies and barely concealed rage, all while Michelle sat in her desk chair taking notes with the methodical precision of someone documenting potential legal evidence. "Diana, please," Douglas said, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "I know I hurt you. I know my family and we handled everything wrong. But I need you to understand what's been happening since you left." He looked terrible, up close. The expensive suit couldn't hide the weight loss or the slight tremor in his hands that suggested either medication or alcohol dependency. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and there was a desperate quality to his movements that reminded me of a cornered animal. "What do you want, Douglas?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Evelyn's baby," he said, running a hand through hair that had grown gray at the temples. "Alexander. He was born with severe developmental delays. The doctors say it might be genetic, that they need family medical history to understand what happened." The irony was staggering. The golden child who'd been carrying the perfect pregnancy, the baby who was supposed to represent everything I'd failed to provide, had been born with the very complications they'd accused me of inviting through my supposed emotional instability. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Whatever I thought of Evelyn and her family, no child deserved to suffer. "The doctors want to test everyone in the family bloodline," Douglas continued. "They think there might be some recessive genetic factor that, Diana, they need to test Isabella too." My breath caught. "Isabella is dead, Douglas. You know that." "The hospital," he said quickly. "They preserved tissue samples. It's standard procedure after what happened, but I need your permission to authorize the genetic testing. As her mother, the word mother hung in the air like a revelation. After 2 years of being told I'd killed my own child through jealousy and spite, Douglas was finally acknowledging what had always been true. Isabella had been my daughter, and I had been her mother. "Why should I help you?" I asked. "After what you and your family did to me?" That's when Douglas broke. The carefully controlled businessman facade crumbled, and what emerged was something pitiful and desperate. "Because Corinne told me the truth," he whispered, "about that night, about what we did to you." Michelle's pen stopped moving. Even she could sense that we'd reached the heart of whatever crisis had brought Douglas to my classroom. "What truth?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "She's been in therapy," Douglas said, his voice shaking, "for her drinking. And her therapist said she had to take responsibility for the harm she'd caused others if she wanted to get sober. So she told me what really happened the night Isabella died." He paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever confession was coming. "She said you never caused the miscarriage. She said Dr. Blackwood explained it was a medical emergency, completely beyond your control. She said you were grieving like any normal mother would grieve, and we turned that grief into evidence of your guilt because we needed someone to blame. The admission should have felt like vindication, but instead it just felt sad. 2 years, too late, delivered only because they needed something from me. And the night we hurt you," Douglas continued, his voice barely audible now. "Corinne said you weren't being dramatic or attention-seeking. You were bleeding and in medical distress, and we attacked you while you were trying to heal from losing our daughter. Our daughter." He'd said it again. Isabella was real to him now, a person who had mattered, whose loss was genuine rather than manufactured drama. "She has security footage," he said quietly. "From that night, Mrs. Brennan across the street has cameras that caught everything. Corinne got a copy when she was making her amends. Diana, I saw what we did to you. I saw you crawling to the street while bleeding. I saw how hurt you were. Mrs. Brennan." I remembered her vaguely, an elderly woman who'd always been suspicious of everyone in the neighborhood. Of course she'd had security cameras. Of course someone had witnessed my worst moment and preserved it digitally. "The footage shows the timeline," Douglas continued. "How long you were inside bleeding before we threw you out. How you couldn't even walk properly. How you collapsed on the sidewalk." His voice cracked. "Diana, we could have killed you that night." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I can't live with what we did anymore," he said simply. "Because Alexander's medical crisis has made me realize that babies die sometimes, and it's no one's fault. Because I've been drinking myself to death for 2 years trying to forget. The look on your face when I kicked you while you were hemorrhaging our daughter. The confession hung in the air like smoke, filling Principal Crawford's office with the weight of acknowledgement that had come 2 years too late to matter for my healing, but might matter for whatever came next. "The genetic testing," I said finally. "If it helps Alexander, yes, you have my permission." Douglas's relief was palpable. "Thank you. Thank you, Diana. I know I don't deserve—" "You're right," I interrupted. "You don't deserve my help. But Alexander does. And Isabella deserves to have her genetic information contribute to helping another child, even if she can't be helped herself." It was the closest I would come to forgiveness, and we both knew it. The ripple effects of Douglas's confession began almost immediately. Within a week of our meeting at school, my phone started ringing with calls from people I'd thought I'd never hear from again. It was as if his admission had opened a floodgate, releasing 2 years of suppressed doubt and carefully buried guilt from everyone who'd witnessed pieces of the Morrison family's campaign against me. The first was Dr. Jennifer Blackwood, my former obstetrician, calling from her personal cell phone on a Saturday morning while I was grading papers at my kitchen table. "Diana, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle professionalism I remembered from my darkest days. Douglas Morrison contacted me about genetic testing for Isabella's tissue samples. When I pulled your file to prepare the documentation, I felt compelled to call you personally. She paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully, the way medical professionals did when treading into territory that bordered on legal liability. I want you to know that I documented everything from the night you lost Isabella, not just the medical details, but the timeline, your emotional state, the appropriateness of your responses to grief. I also noted my significant concerns about your family's reaction to your loss. Another pause, longer this time. Diana, I've been an obstetrician for 20 years, and I've never seen a family respond to pregnancy loss the way yours did. It troubled me enough that I made extensive notes. Legal proceedings. The thought hadn't occurred to me, but apparently Dr. Blackwood had been thinking about potential litigation for 2 years. Those records document that you exhibited normal grief responses for a woman who'd lost a wanted pregnancy at 7 months, she continued. There's nothing in your behavior or medical history that would suggest you caused or contributed to the placental abruption. In fact, my notes specifically state that the family's accusations were medically baseless and psychologically harmful to your recovery. The second call came from Pedro, Evelyn's husband, whose voice was thick with emotion and shame when he reached out 3 days later. Diana, I owe you an apology that's 2 years overdue, he said without preamble. I should have spoken up that night. I should have called 911 when I saw what was happening to you. I should have physically intervened to stop them from hurting. I've been carrying the guilt of my cowardice ever since. He told me about Alexander's condition in detail, not just the developmental delays Douglas had mentioned, but seizures that required constant monitoring, feeding difficulties that made every meal a 2-hour struggle, and a prognosis that remained uncertain despite months of intensive therapy. The doctors say early intervention helps, but we won't know the full extent of his limitations until he's older, Pedro said, his voice cracking. Every day I watch Evelyn blame herself, and every day I think about how your family blamed you for something equally beyond anyone's control. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. She's not handling any of this well, Pedro admitted. She's convinced Alexander's condition is divine punishment for what the family did to you. She keeps saying she participated in attacking a grieving mother, and now she's being punished through her own child. She asked me to call and tell you how sorry she is, but she's too ashamed and mentally fragile to face you herself. The third call was perhaps the most surprising, coming from Claire Patterson, my former colleague from Millbrook Elementary, who reached out after hearing about my return to teaching through the education community grapevine. Diana, I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for almost 2 years, she said during our coffee meeting the following week, her hands shaking as she stirred sugar into her latte. That day I saw you at the farmer's market when you had that panic attack. I went home and called Douglas to check on you. My blood ran cold. Claire had inadvertently given Douglas information about where I was, what I was doing, who I was with, potentially enabling him to track my movements during my recovery period. He told me you were having severe mental health issues, that you'd become obsessed with him and were following his family around town, she continued, her voice heavy with regret. He made it sound like you were dangerous, like a stalker who couldn't accept that your marriage was over. Diana, I believed him. I actually believed you were the problem. But Claire had done something else after that conversation. Disturbed by something in Douglas's tone, she'd felt compelled to reach out to other mutual acquaintances from our teaching days. What she discovered was a comprehensive pattern of Douglas controlling the narrative about our marriage, systematically, painting himself as the long-suffering husband of an increasingly unstable wife. I talked to 12 different people who knew you both, Claire revealed. Every single conversation followed the same script. Douglas would express concern about your mental health, suggest you were jealous of other people's happiness, imply that you'd become erratic and possibly dangerous since the miscarriage, She'd documented these conversations, creating an informal record of Douglas's campaign to destroy my reputation throughout our shared professional and social circles. Dr. Roberts never believed his story, Claire revealed. She said you were one of the most emotionally stable, professionally competent teachers she'd worked with in 30 years of education. She's been keeping your personnel file active, hoping you'd return to teaching someday. She actually told me she'd hire you back in a heartbeat if you ever wanted to come home to Millbrook. The truth was spreading through our old social circles like water finding its way through cracks in concrete. 2 years of carefully constructed lies were crumbling under the weight of one moment of honesty, forced by medical necessity, revealing the systematic nature of the Morrison family's psychological warfare against me. The moment of complete vindication came not through legal proceedings or public confrontation, but through a phone call from an unexpected source on a quiet Sunday evening in April. I was in my apartment kitchen, preparing lesson plans for the following week, while Ander worked on glazing pottery pieces at the small table we'd converted into his temporary studio space. "Is this Diana Morrison? Excuse me, Diana Blake?" The voice was crisp, professional, belonging to someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news with clinical precision. "This is Attorney Janet Hoffman from the State Prosecutor's Office. I believe you may want to hear about some recent developments regarding your former husband and his family." My hands began to shake as I set down the red pen I'd been using to grade student essays. The stack of papers about my hero suddenly seemed absurdly innocent compared to whatever information was about to shatter the peaceful Sunday evening. Routine Ander and I had established. Ander looked up from his work, immediately sensing the shift in the room's energy. His artist's intuition for reading emotional atmospheres had become one of the things I treasured most about him. His ability to know when I needed space and when I needed support without me having to ask. "We've received a formal complaint filed by Corinne Morrison regarding domestic violence that occurred at the Morrison family estate approximately 2 years ago," Attorney Hoffman continued, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who dealt with traumatic cases daily. "She's provided security footage from a neighbor's camera system, medical records from your hospitalization, and detailed witness testimony about events leading up to and including the assault. Ms. Blake, are you the victim referenced in this complaint?" The world seemed to tilt sideways. Corinne, the same woman who had held my arms while her brother kicked me, who had pressed me down onto that white sofa while I bled our daughter's life away, had gone to the authorities, had voluntarily incriminated herself and her entire family to ensure justice was served. "Yes," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Ms. Morrison's confession is quite detailed and, frankly, disturbing," the attorney continued. "She's described what appears to be a coordinated assault involving multiple family members against a woman who is recovering from both major surgery and severe psychological trauma. She's also provided evidence of a systematic pattern of psychological abuse, isolation tactics, and emotional manipulation that preceded the physical violence." Attorney Hoffman explained that Corinne's therapist, a specialist in addiction recovery, had insisted that true sobriety required taking complete responsibility for the harm she'd caused others. When Corinne had initially balked at contacting law enforcement, claiming the family had already suffered enough, her therapist had explained that failing to report the assault made her complicit in potentially future violence against other victims. "The security footage is quite damaging to the defendants," Attorney Hoffman said gently, her professional composure softening slightly as she recognized the impact this conversation was having on me. "It clearly shows you being forcibly restrained and assaulted by multiple individuals while you were visibly injured and bleeding. There's also audio recording of you begging for medical help that was ignored, and documentation of your condition when you finally collapsed on the street." My legs gave out, and I sank into the nearest chair. Ander was beside me immediately, his clay-stained hand warm and steady on my shoulder, grounding me to the present moment when the past threatened to pull me under. "What happens now?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when everything inside me felt like chaos. That depends partly on you, the attorney replied. Ms. Morrison has already been charged with assault and conspiracy to commit assault. Douglas Morrison and Carrie Morrison are being charged with aggravated assault, conspiracy, and potentially attempted murder. Given your medical condition at the time of the attack and the life-threatening nature of their actions. The words attempted murder hung in the air like a thunderclap. The legal system was finally acknowledging what I'd known in my bones that night, that the Morrison family's actions could have killed me, and very nearly did. The medical evidence is particularly compelling, Attorney Hoffman continued. Doctor, Blackwood's records indicate that assaulting someone in your post-surgical condition while they were already bleeding could easily have caused fatal hemorrhaging. Several emergency room physicians have agreed to testify about how close you came to dying that night. She paused, allowing me to process the magnitude of what she was telling me. They're also facing significant civil liability, the attorney added. The district attorney's office has been in contact with several medical malpractice attorneys who specialize in cases involving violence against patients with pre-existing medical conditions. The financial exposure for the Morrison family is potentially substantial. For 2 years, I'd believed that healing meant moving forward without looking back, that justice was less important than peace, that the best revenge was living well. But as I listened to Attorney Hoffman describe the charges, I realized that some stories needed their proper ending, not for revenge but for protection. I want to cooperate fully, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Whatever you need from me, whatever testimony or evidence I can provide, I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. The truth hadn't just set me free, it was about to ensure that what happened to me could never happen to anyone else at the hands of the Morrison family. Justice was finally coming, delivered not by my pursuit of revenge, but by the conscience of someone who'd participated in my destruction and found the courage to make it right. The trial took place 8 months later, in a courthouse that felt both imposing and strangely liberating. I testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through every detail of Isabella's death, the family's systematic psychological abuse, and the night they nearly killed me with their coordinated assault. The hardest part wasn't reliving the trauma. Dr. Kim had prepared me well for that. The hardest part was watching Douglas, Carrie, and Corinne sitting at the defendant's table, looking like ordinary people who couldn't possibly be capable of such calculated cruelty. Corinne had taken a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation, but she still faced 18 months in prison and mandatory anger management counseling. She'd written me a letter that her attorney delivered, 4 pages of apologies and explanations that I read once and then burned. Some wounds don't heal through other people's guilt. Douglas received the harshest sentence, 3 years in state, prison for aggravated assault, plus additional time for violating the restraining order I'd obtained after learning about the charges. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, noted that assaulting a woman who was recovering from pregnancy loss showed a level of cruelty that demands significant consequences. Carrie, despite her age, received 2 years in minimum security prison. Her lawyer had argued for house arrest due to her standing in the community, but the judge wasn't impressed by Morrison family connections. Enabling and participating in violence against a grieving mother shows a complete absence of the maternal instincts this defendant claims to possess, Judge Martinez said during sentencing. Age and social status are not shields against accountability. The civil settlement was substantial enough that I could have stopped working if I'd wanted to. Instead, I used part of it to establish the Isabella Rose Memorial Fund, providing grief counseling and support services for families who'd experienced pregnancy loss. The rest went into savings for the future Ander and I were building together. Because 6 months after the trial ended, Ander proposed, not with grand gestures or public declarations, but on a quiet Tuesday evening while we were preparing dinner, in his kitchen. He was chopping vegetables for our stir-fry when he suddenly stopped and turned to me. "I love the life we've built together," he said simply. "I love how you've taught me that healing is possible. that trauma doesn't define a person's worth. That courage looks like getting up every day and choosing to trust again. Will you marry me? The ring was a simple band with a small diamond, nothing like the ostentatious Morrison family heirloom I'd once worn. It fit perfectly, both literally and metaphorically. The wedding was everything my first marriage hadn't been: small, intimate, focused on love rather than appearances. My parents flew in from Oregon. My students made us a banner that read, "Congratulations, Ms. Diana and Mr. Ander," in finger-painted letters. Principal Crawford officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for our ceremony. Pedro and Evelyn sent a card but didn't attend. Alexander was doing better. The genetic testing had revealed a treatable condition that required ongoing therapy, but offered hope for a relatively normal life. Evelyn was reportedly in counseling, finally dealing with the guilt that had consumed her since my assault. Douglas sent nothing, which was exactly what I wanted from him. 3 years after being thrown bleeding from their doorstep, I had not just survived the Morrison family's cruelty. I had built something beautiful from the ashes of their destruction. Justice had been served, wounds had healed, and life had revealed its capacity for restoration beyond anything I'd thought possible. 5 years after losing Isabella, I stood in the nursery of our new home, painting walls the color of morning sunshine while my 6-month-old son Leo slept peacefully in his crib. The room was nothing like the formal, Pinterest-perfect nursery I'd created in the Morrison estate. This space was warm, lived in, filled with hand-me-down furniture from friends and artwork from my students who'd insisted on contributing to baby Leo's room. Leo had arrived on a snowy February morning, 3 weeks early but perfectly healthy, with Anders' gentle brown eyes and my stubborn chin. The pregnancy had been monitored carefully, but there were no complications, no medical emergencies, no family members suggesting I was somehow unfit for motherhood. Just 2 people who loved each other welcoming a child they'd planned and wanted together. The birth was everything Isabella's death hadn't been: peaceful, joyful, surrounded by people who celebrated our family rather than judging it. When Leo took his first breath and let out that indignant newborn cry, I felt Isabella's presence in the room like a blessing rather than a loss. She would have been an amazing big sister, Anders said that night as we watched Leo sleep in the hospital bassinet. It was the first time either of us had spoken Isabella's name aloud in Leo's presence, and it felt right rather than heartbreaking. Now, as I put the finishing touches on Leo's mobile, clay animals Ander had sculpted by hand, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The Morrison family's attempt to destroy me had ultimately led me to discover strength I never knew I possessed. Their cruelty had taught me to recognize genuine kindness when it appeared. Their rejection had forced me to build a chosen family, based on love rather than obligation. Douglas had been released from prison 8 months ago. I knew this only because the victim's advocate had called to notify me, as required by law. He'd violated his parole twice, both times for drinking, and was currently serving an additional 6 months. His real estate license had been revoked, his family's social standing permanently damaged by the trial publicity. Carrie had moved to Florida after her release, reportedly living with a distant cousin and working as a retail clerk. Felt nothing about these updates except a mild sadness that they'd chosen to let bitterness consume them rather than using their consequences as motivation for change. My students at Riverside Elementary had grown and moved on to 4th grade, but new 8-year-olds filled my classroom each September, bringing fresh energy and renewed purpose to my days. Principal Crawford had been promoted to district supervisor, but not before establishing a school counseling program using funds from the Isabella Rose Memorial Foundation. Leo stirred in his crib, making the soft baby sounds that meant he'd wake soon for his afternoon feeding. As I picked him up, breathing in that perfect baby scent of innocence and possibility, I thought about the letter I'd written to Isabella on Leo's first birthday. "I carry you with me always," I'd written. Not as grief, but as love. Not as loss, but as the first chapter of my story about becoming a mother. Leo will know about his sister who came before him, who taught me that love doesn't end with death, that families can be broken and reformed, that healing is possible even after the worst imaginable pain. The woman who'd crawled bleeding from the Morrison estate could never have imagined this life, this peace, this joy, this ordinary Tuesday afternoon painting nursery walls while her healthy son slept safely nearby. Sometimes the most profound victories look like the simplest moments. Making dinner with your husband, helping your child with homework, choosing paint colors for a baby's room. I had learned that surviving isn't the same as living, but living fully is the best revenge against those who tried to destroy you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.